Good day, everybody. Even as we gather today, we're seeing student protests on campuses lead this news cycle, which reminds us that this generation of students is facing a wave of issues, from post-pandemic trauma to global conflicts to new questions about campus safety. So the question is, does the student experience need to be redesigned to better engage students and make their institutions more welcoming? That's the topic we're going to tackle today on the next office hour. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next office hour. I'm Jeff Selingo. I'm the host and moderator for today's discussion. And for the next hour, we're going to be talking about the landscape for student well-being. If this is your first next office hour, welcome. As veterans to this webcast know, it is named after my bi-weekly newsletter of the same name that covers what's next for higher ed. If you're not a subscriber, we'll add a link to the chat to subscribe. Today's office hour would not have been possible without the support of Vector Solutions. In a special short recorded case study from Vector we'll have later in this webcast, you'll be hearing from an interview that I did last week with Jen Jacobson, who is Macalester College's Executive Director of Health and Wellness. It was a great conversation and really happy to bring that to you about halfway through today's webcast. Now, before we get started, a few logistics. One, we are recording this session, and everyone who has registered will get an email to an on-demand recording later this week. So you will get that recording later this week as long as you registered. Second, if you have a question for any of our panelists throughout the hour today, please add it to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. You will see other questions there as the hour goes on, so feel free to upvote those questions if you want. Finally, as many of you have already discovered, the chat is open, so please feel free to participate in the discussion there. You can emphasize points made by any of the speakers. You can ask questions of your fellow attendees, or let us know what you're doing to tackle the issues that we're discussing today, and perhaps even where you see opportunities. These office hours are best when we learn from each other, and I always walk away with new ideas and learning from what other institutions are doing. So first, please tell us where you're joining us from today. Again, I could tell that people have done this before because they're already adding it in the chat. We had more than 1,200 people sign up for today. So tell us your institution and city to give us a sense of who's in the room. Ann Arbor, Michigan, Charlotte, North Carolina, Lawrence, Kansas, Arkansas, George Mason or Madison University, Townsend, Maryland. Where else are you joining us from today? Ohio University in Athens, Charlottesville, Virginia, Oakland, California, Haverford College in Pennsylvania, Keene State College in New Hampshire, New York University. We have Portland, Maine, Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, Washington State University in Washington, University of South Alabama. So some great institutions, folks joining us from all around the country. Again, please share your insights and learning with each other, because that's how I think these next office hours work best. So let's get started by welcoming my panel for today. We have three great individuals joining us for this hour-long conversation today. So we have Luoluo Hong, who's Vice President for Student Engagement and Wellbeing at the Georgia Institute of Technology. We have Robert Hradsky, who is Vice President for Student Engagement at Syracuse University. And we have Francy Brown-McClure, who's Vice President for Student Affairs at Jacobson State University. So please welcome me and welcome them for the next office hour. Thank you all for joining us today. It's great to have all three of you with us. So I want to start with a kind of a level setting question for all of you, and let's just do a lightning round around the group here today. I just want to get a sense of the current landscape of student mental health and well-being within your institution. How would you describe it today? Let's just go around quickly to each of you. Luoluo, I'll start with you at Georgia Tech.
Jeff, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joined us for this afternoon. I'm looking forward to our Talk Story session. So at Georgia Tech, I'm finishing up my third year. And I think the best way to characterize our efforts is that we have really expanded our area of focus. When I first arrived, we were almost singularly and solely focused on mental health as a contributing, defining factor of well-being. And I'm pleased to say that after 3 years of really mindfully, purposefully doing outreach and messaging and pivoting in our approach, that we really are fully embracing the 8 dimensions of wellness and recognizing that there's so many different factors that contribute to students' well-being. And that includes their ability to create authentic, genuine connections and have a sense of belonging and community. So that's where we are today.
Great. Rob, how about you at Syracuse University?
Good afternoon. So about 5 years ago at SU, we developed an integrated health and wellness model that brought together our primary healthcare, mental health care, health prevention, and recreation services to really look holistically at student well-being. And we've seen a lot of great success with this model and are engaged in campus-wide conversations with academic colleagues about trauma-informed teaching and learning, as well as environmental factors that support a culture of wellness. And we're also seeing that our targeted prevention strategies are reducing high risk and violent behaviors on campus. Student buy-in to this approach is high, as is utilization of services. So while we still have much more work to do, I'm pretty optimistic about the steps we're taking to improve student well-being on campus.
Great. And Francy, how about at Jackson State University? How would you describe it today?
Absolutely. So Jackson State is a historically Black university, and I think that's really important because of the cultural context there. So we're doing a lot of work around education in our community and really demystifying mental health in particular for our students. And so we have seen a good amount of success there with our educational efforts and being proactive with students instead of being reactive. We've done a significant amount of partnering with our academic affairs colleagues and really trying to make sure that students can get the support they need anywhere they go, because we realize that students don't necessarily see us as distinct in student affairs or academic affairs, but they're just looking for who they can go to and who they have a connection with. And so we are seeing an increase in the desire for students to seek out our services, but we're trying to make sure that everyone on the campus is equipped to make sure that they can show up for students when they need to.
And just quickly to go around again, what's been the impetus for what's happening now? Is it one thing, or is it a series of things that you've seen both nationally and locally? Because as I talk to a number of presidents and boards, they know they have to spend more time, money, and effort on this front, but they don't really know sometimes why, right? So tell us a little bit about maybe what's been what has really, I guess, resonated with your leadership at your institutions? And Francie, let's start with you at Jackson State.
Sure. So I think the biggest part is we're still seeing the effects of COVID. And the reality is we are going to see that for many years to come until the babies who were born during the COVID times are finished with college. We're seeing those effects still. And so there's been a lot as it pertains to that. I think in my particular institution, housing insecurity and food insecurity, just with the rising cost of housing in areas, is contributing to students' overall well-being, and they're worried about, what am I going to do, how am I going to live? And so I can't necessarily focus on these other pieces, and that also has played a very significant role on our campus. The final piece that has shown up a lot for us has been athletic prowess. So we have a lot of student athletes and have had a lot of national attention to our student athletes. With that national attention comes a lot of performance anxiety and a lot of pressure. And so we're starting to see increases in the amount of student athletes who are needing our services in very different ways and having to think differently about the way we support them for their specific needs.
So Luoluo and Rob, I want to move on to some design of programs, but quickly, either of you, in terms of what's been the impetus that kind of got the attention of your senior leadership. Luoluo, let's go to you, and then Rob quickly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that became really clear is that we cannot hire our way out of this, right? What's happening on our campuses is really reflective of what's happening, not just nationally, but globally in all of our communities, not just in higher ed. And I think what we found is that a lot of what we need to do and be disciplined and have the willingness to do doesn't necessarily cost money. So the biggest takeaway, I think, for us at Georgia Tech over the last 3 years is that we can't just hire more counselors, for example. That actually isn't really what we found is what we need. But we need to change the culture. And we heard from students over and over and over again. We're also hearing it from our faculty and staff. You can't tell us one thing on the one hand. Take better care of yourselves, take better care of each other. But on the other hand, as an organization in our institutional practices, policies, and approaches to how we get things done, actually create an add to stress. And so that cultural change piece is, I think, where we are really trying to pivot. As an institution like Georgia Tech, where the academic rigor is very strong and it's what we pride ourselves in, similar to what Francy was talking about, for our students, things like stereotype threat and imposter syndrome are really important. So if you just focus on getting mental health help, but not addressing aspects of our organizational culture that contribute to exacerbating those, we're not really addressing the full picture.
How about Rob? How about at Syracuse? Just one thing or multiple things that kind of got everyone's attention there?
Yeah, so I think similar to Luoluo, we realized we would never be able to fully fund a traditional therapy model, and I think on top of that, there's a significant amount of evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of non-therapeutic approaches to address some of the major issues that we're seeing, like anxiety, depression, and stress. So, we've been very heavily invested in some of those approaches as well as our prevention initiatives.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about those approaches and designing those approaches. And Lola, let me start with you because I know we've talked in the past about, thinking about well-being as like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that there are certain levers that you think campus leaders need to pull first, right? We've mentioned housing insecurity and food insecurity before succeeding on other fronts like student success, right? That there's this hierarchy of needs. Can you explain that when it comes to kind of well-being?
Yeah, this is something that I've reflected on a long time when I think about how universities build their orientation curriculums, right? Let's be honest, I think I'm going to say something that many of you are going to recognize. Orientation planning is oftentimes like a little bit of a political warfare, right? Everyone wants their time, and then you have to like play favorites and juggle and deal and wheel and all that. And I think if we focus on just in time, what do students need to hear before they arrive to campus, the first 2 weeks, the first month, the first, semester, that type of thing. And I think it's the same thing when we're building our efforts and our initiatives to support student well-being. One of the things that is so important to acknowledge is that well-being is like graduation. You cannot directly impact well-being with a program or service, right? You can only contribute to the conditions and efforts that we know the research indicates are more likely to foster well-being for students. And so for us, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy at that bottom, students are going to have a difficult time taking care of themselves at that upper end if we don't address things like food, clothing, and I think what we learned in the pandemic, access to IT, right? If you don't have the basic tools to be a student. But I think what's emerging for many of us is historically physical safety was at that bottom foundational level for Maslow's hierarchy. I think for today's college student, psychological safety has a power and influence that is just as significant in many ways as physical safety. And so that's why we've really emphasized here at Georgia Tech, how do we foster belonging, create a sense of community, and facilitate students building those connections from day one.
So, Francy, as you think about designing these programs, what are some of the more critical factors that you think really are effective? And how do you ensure that they're also culturally sensitive and inclusive at the same time?
Absolutely. And the majority of what I think I'm going to say is tagging along with what Lolo was talking about. I think institutional culture is so very important because, a lot of us will spend time going to conferences. We'll see what somebody else is doing at their institution and say, great, this is fantastic. I love it. I'm going to bring it back to my institution. But if that does not work for your particular student population, it is not going to be effective on your campus. Again, understanding my institutional context, I'm at a public HBCU in the state of Mississippi. What works here for our students is going to be very, very different from other institutions. And so that part is critical when you are planning what you are doing. You have to understand what is your institution, the context of your institution and the way it works, but also what is the culture of your student body to the piece of being inclusive of our students, again, how are we involving them in this process? As a lot of times as administrators, we make great decisions that are actually not going to be productive for our students, because that makes sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to them. And so for us, in anything that we do, we are involving our key student leaders in those conversations, because they are the ones that are living amongst each other. They are the ones that are seeing things and hearing things in real time. And they are the ones to say, yes, this actually makes sense. Hey, tweak this. Hey, think about this. So for me, it really is about understanding that institutional culture, tailoring the needs of the program to your specific student population, and understanding who your key stakeholders are. You cannot run these programs in isolation. It's not going to work. I think all of us have stated it can't just be the work of the counseling center. We can't hire our way out of this. It has to be an institutional effort. Everybody has to take ownership in this, and everybody has to understand that they play a role. Again, in interaction with the student, they are not looking to distinguish between your title, your years that you've been there, or your education. They need the assistance. And so how are we making sure that when we get to them, that we are giving them what they need so that they will come back and continue to seek assistance in other spaces?
Yeah, and I really like what you just said, right? It makes sense to us, not them, right? And so, Rob, I think that goes back to this idea of the student experience. This is all the rage everywhere I go now. Everybody's talking about the student experience. Nobody could adequately always define it, I don't think, what they actually mean by the student experience. So what does it look like in the modern day university? And what are the approaches to getting to designing a better one? What do you think are the big levers that really need to be pulled when you even think in your own context of the student experience at Syracuse, for example?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think in higher ed, we've been really slow to look at the experience for students holistically and have been very siloed for a long period of time. And I think obviously to achieve the best outcomes for students, we need to look at the student experience holistically in terms of what happens across the university. So it's the classroom environment, it's residential spaces, the research lab, it's the activities and places where students find community and belonging. It's experiential learning. And it's also the ways in which our students transact business with us. So in terms of approaches, I think we need to ensure that, our staff and faculty are using trauma-informed approaches in their work, including in the learning environment, utilizing an equity mindset and creating a community on campus in which all students fully matter and belong. It's investing in prevention strategies and resources that improve student well-being, and utilizing digital tools to help students navigate the university, engage in opportunities for self-growth, and streamline the transactional pieces of college so that students can focus on academic pursuits as well as personal growth and development.
Yeah, I think the transactional pieces of college, right? Especially for first generation students who don't have experiences of dealing with institutions. I will tell you, even somebody who's been to college, who's reported on college for 25 years, when I end up on a campus, just navigating it is really hard, right? Because again, things make sense to all of you. They don't necessarily make sense to me, and they're different, even among your own three institutions. So let's talk, Rob, you mentioned technology there. At the end there. How I want to ask, I'll start with you and Francy on this. How have technological solutions been integrated into your well-being programs, and have they had a reach and effectiveness? Are you kind of pleased with that, or do you think there's room to grow? Rob, let me start with you, and then Francy, I'll go to you.
Sure. Yeah. I think technology solutions have allowed us to really scale our interventions, at reasonable cost so that we're reaching the entire campus community. And they've reduced some of the labor intensity of our in-person presentations. They also provide customized solutions, that allow students, staff, and faculty to engage with the tool sort of at the times and places convenient for them. And also allow students and others to engage sensitive topics privately. And then I think we've also had some success with sort of creating some level setting and normalizing some behaviors for students as well. And we've been able to do that through apps like Headspace that have really helped students look at mindfulness and other things. I think the challenge is that you know, a lot of times the content will prompt particular questions or feelings, and it's difficult with the technology to really connect that individual with a live person, you know, and it may not be as engaging through technology as it is in person. And then I think also often when we have a presenter, you know, working with our students, you know, through technology, you lose that personal touch that you would have during that in-person presentation, and often that personal connection.
Yeah. Francy, how about at Jackson State? Has it been effective using technology or not so much?
Yes, it has been effective. We have an increase in the amount of students that are enrolled in our online programs. And as institutions, sometimes we forget our online students. And so the ability to utilize technology allows us to make sure that those students have access to the resources and that they can connect as well. It also really allows for spaces and places where people may not have a diverse staff set to be able to meet the diverse needs of their student body.
That's
And
good.
so that is the case for us. We don't necessarily always have staff that identify or specialize in the areas that our student body does. And so this use of technology allows them to still feel connected and get the resources that they need. I also think a benefit of technology is the assessment components that can come along with that. Because again, as institutions, we have to take the time to make sure that we are assessing our efforts, getting good data, and adjusting as needed. The final thing I'll say on this, and I know that we're talking about student well-being, but again, the use of technology has been helpful for our faculty and staff as well when we can provide those tools to them, because they are the ones who, again, are working with our students. And so it's important that we are supporting their efforts and their initiatives as they are supporting the students.
Yeah, and although like sometimes technology though can backfire, right, in terms of promoting well-being. You told me you've seen examples of this.
Absolutely. And I think ironically, it does come from the pandemic where we have students who are still experiencing the trauma of having been feeling isolated and alienated. And so that's one thing I'm actually particularly interested in is we have so much research that we're seeing about the impact of overuse of social media, for example, on the mental health and well-being of children and teenagers. And we're seeing students who are coming to our campuses now who represent that generation. So I think we've been mindful about, you know, many of us on this Zoom are probably from a generation that we got pulled kicking and screaming to use technology. And I think in the college students that we're seeing, we have to pull them kicking and screaming to let go of their technology. And so I think, can it be helpful? Absolutely. But one of the things we've been mindful of, particularly at a tech institution, right, is how can we create mindfulness about the roles in which tech can help, but can also be a detriment to well-being. So some of our workshops, for example, we have a tech-free zone. Students come in, they need to drop off their cell phone, and you know, you can divorce your phone for 45 minutes, right? And we process what that is like and talk about how FOMO, right? Like
Yeah.
that is an aspect of well-being. And so it's examining the ways in which technology can contribute to, can be a barrier in some ways to emotional wellness, social wellness, spiritual wellness, et cetera. And so again, bringing it in, but also being mindful that it can be a barrier at the same time.
So we're going to go to our pre-recorded interview in about 5 minutes, but I just want to do a quick round of questions around kind of effectiveness. We're also getting some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and please keep adding stuff there. I'm kind of interested in let's start with you, Francy, on improving kind of academic performance, sense of belonging, you know, retention and student success are really important to colleges and universities. Have you seen directly how how prevention programs really show up in academic performance and the sense of belonging?
Absolutely. To the academic performance component, when students, and again, this is the topic of emotional safety, that is huge for students. And so when students do feel like I am safe in this space, I have places where I can go and feel like I am heard and seen, that being seen part is very important. That does contribute to their overall well-being and their ability to be successful in their courses. We have worked with a number of students where faculty have come to us and said, hey, I'm concerned about this particular student. We have made sure that we've worked with that student, connected them to resources, provided interventions where needed, and we can literally see a change in the performance of the students. And so we know that those interventions are working for those particular students. And so absolutely, this type of work and these efforts are effective for our student population here on our campus. I also think, to the sense of belonging, there is something important about making sure that students understand that they're not going through this alone and in isolation. And for so many students, they believe this is only my experience. I'm the only one who is going through this. I'm the only one who's experiencing this. And so to see it in front of them, to know that other students are experiencing this, to be able to interact with other students, and to also, for a number of our students, to read, to see, oh, what I was feeling is an actual thing. This isn't something that I've created. This isn't something that I've made up in some kind of way. This is very real, and other people are experiencing that, starts to normalize it and humanize it for them in a way that makes them say, okay, this isn't just me, and I'm connected, and feel like there's space for me to talk about this, and I can do that in this place that I call home.
Rob, when I talk to presidents and trustees a lot, it's all about money, revenue, right? Enrollment. So how can this focus on well-being and safety kind of show up in enrollment and retention of results so that you can connect those two things, right?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a data geek, so let me share some data with you. So we know from a fall 22 Gallup Lumina survey that mental health is now a bigger retention concern than academics or finances. And among four-year students who considered dropping out, 69% of respondents reported emotional stress as the reason, 59% reported mental health. And for comparison purposes, a little more than a third talked about cost, and then a little more than a quarter, talked about academic performance. And then Healthy Minds also in 22-23 revealed that 81% of students indicated that their mental health negatively impacted their academic performance in the prior 4 weeks. So I think when you look at what students are telling us about their mental health, and I see safety as part of that equation as well, it's really critically important that we're creating, a multitude of resources. We're building that culture of wellness so that we're really promoting student well-being. And then in turn, I think we'll see higher retention rates.
Yeah. So, Lolo, before we go to this video that I recorded last week, I wanted to ask you a question that actually came up in the chat from John Pryor about how you're gathering data on your programs, both for evaluation, but also where to put target areas for more programming. How are you doing that, Lolo, at Georgia Tech, perhaps?
Yeah. So I posted our link to our Cultivate Wellbeing roadmap at Georgia Tech. There's one for students and one for faculty and staff. And one of the things that is really important is that, Rob shared some of the databases that we have also at Georgia Tech. But one thing that was remarkable when I first got here is, though we've been collecting the data, no one had really looked at it or even knew that it existed. So we brought light to that data and really identified our priority areas of action by looking at that data. But one thing I think that is important about this conversation is, how does this contribute to the academic mission? I know that many of us are struggling with the politics in our various states and other external stakeholders with DEI and where that fits. And one thing that's important is that you cannot advance well-being without also addressing health equity.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, I was listening to Francy, this whole idea of belonging. So two resources that I want to share. It's the Belonging book by Jeffrey Cohen, rich with data, and then also the Student Experience Project. You can literally just Google that and you will get their website. And what I like about them is that they are both trying to foster a sense of belonging, cultivate well-being, but also looking at how do you close those educational equity gaps. And that by working to promote well-being and belonging, that it's almost like universal design, right? In helping to accommodate learning disabilities, that you actually will have the impact of improving and closing those educational and health equity gaps. And so I really recommend both resources, but there's simple things that don't cost money, and they're about changing the culture, changing the academic experience, which is where the student spends the majority of their time, right, during their academic journey. So I think that, and again, the data is leading us to look at these things as an important impact in our students' lives.
And we'll add those resources into the chat in the next half. So, last week I had the chance to catch up with Jen Jacobson, who's executive director of Macalester College's Center for Health and Wellness, where we got to talk about the ROI of prevention and some of her work with our sponsor today, Vector Solutions, on evidence-based training. This is a really great case study of what one institution is doing in this space. And when we return with a panel on the other side of this interview, we'll talk about how to involve faculty and staff so that we're all rowing in the same direction on well-being and safety. So here is my interview with Jen, and we'll be back after this interview. Hi, Jen. Welcome to the next office hour. So we often think of prevention training for students as checking a box, but you found that the ROI of prevention goes well beyond checking a box. Indeed, prevention really could connect to other strategic outcomes for the college, such as things like academic performance or career readiness. Can you give us a quick example or two of that?
Sure. The latest American College Health Association National College Health Assessment Survey asks questions about whether students might be likely to leave their institution before they graduate. And one of the things we're seeing is one of the top reasons they're considering that is having a negative experience on campus. When we think about negative experiences, we know from the same survey that talks about relationships of all kinds, creating challenges and problems, that sometimes those are interpersonal negative experiences. So when I think about when we do prevention work, when we're thinking about pro-social work, when we're thinking about active bystander work, we might very well be limiting that number of negative experiences, which increases our students' quality of experience at our institutions, makes them less likely to transfer and more likely to persist. I also think, when I look at the work we do around alcohol and other drugs, people often underestimate the role alcohol and other drugs play with mental health. We often think of them as maybe a strategy our students are using to cope with mental health, and we know that interferes with sleep, with academic performance. But also sometimes alcohol, cannabis precipitates mental health challenges. And so when we think about doing prevention work, that's also support of mental health. Substance use prevention is mental health promotion. And then lastly, I think about over the years with the prevention work that I've done with student athletes and thinking about their leadership and again, those active bystander skills, those are the notes that I get back from people when they're in med school, when they've joined the armed forces to say, this was a new concept to everyone around me. And I was a leader on day one because we had done this work.
Yeah. So prevention training sometimes is also checking a box for even those who work at the institution. So can you tell us a little bit more about your work with Vector and the importance of using evidence-based training and how you use data around social norms in particular?
Sure. One of our jobs as educators at colleges is teaching health literacy. And maybe it's never been more important to help students navigate not only health misinformation, but health disinformation. And one of the things by doing social norms work with data we are collecting locally at our own institution, number one, it's of most relevance and value to the students on our campus. When we share back with our first year students what the norms are of their incoming class, it's the most salient, but also it gives us the opportunity to share with them, this is where the data came from. You can ask us questions, but this is why it's relevant. The other thing that I think is interesting, is we use that also to educate those student mentors who are working with our first year students so that, we might use last year's data as we're doing RA training in the summer or student athlete mentor training or orientation leader to help get them in the headspace of what our incoming first year class is like. And again, it's really local and relevant data, which makes our students more accepting of it. But we know we have large norms, misperceptions on our campuses around substance use and other behaviors.
So students are coming from all over the country and even the world to campuses. So can you tell us a little bit about the importance of building awareness around state and federal laws? Because I know that's a big piece of your work as well.
Sure, and it's really relevant for us here in Minnesota. Adult use cannabis was legalized here on August 1st of 2023. So one of the things we made sure we did is in the alcohol and other drug segment of Vector, we included about the Minnesota state law, but actually what that meant for us as a campus that accepts federal funding, and how use would not be allowed on campus, making our international students aware that it was still federally illegal and could jeopardize their visa status, and certainly letting our students know that adult use law was for people 21 and over. And the most fascinating outcome of that is during orientation, I have a wheel of norms, you spin it, it clicks, and then there's a different norms question. And the non-norms question we added was true or false, you can use cannabis on campus at Macalester College. And not only did every first year who came by get it right 100% of the time, and the only place it was communicated was through our Vector training, they often not only wanted to answer the question, but tell us why. And they very accurately said, because most students on campus aren't 21 and because we accept federal funding. And so it was such a way for us to get ahead before our students even arrived on campus to know what the federal regulations were and what that meant on our campus. I mean, it was really funny because we had some faculty and staff come by and spin the wheel, and they were not 100%
And they didn't get it right.
accurate like our first year students were.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier about athletes. What about online training for athletes? What are the challenges and opportunities for that community? Because it's a big community on many college campuses, obviously.
Right. So it's such an opportunity. People sometimes focus or frame things solely on the risk factors for student athletes. And I think we get more buy-in from our athletic department leaders, our coaches, and our student athletes themselves when we lean into the protective factors. One of the things I like to share with our student athletes is they have more opportunities than any other students on campus to learn about resources, learn about how to support other students. And I think about, those protective factors of shared values and goals, the accountability, mentoring across class years. They often have a big influence on our social environments. When I work with student athletes across different athletic conferences, one of the top things that comes into play is time, right? That time management to have excellence in the classroom and excellence on the athletic field. And when I think about online training, I feel like that gives us an efficient way for students to develop a common language and a common baseline on their own time, so that when we come together in person for that hour of training or hour and 15 minutes of training, we can actually make that time count by not having to go over definitions, but to be able to jump right into social norms, group dynamics, and what's important to that group right there.
In many ways, like flipping the classroom, where they're getting this
Absolutely.
information in advance so that you could spend time with
Absolutely.
them in person. We know students and families are kind of choosing colleges increasingly on well-being and safety. So I want to kind of get back to this enrollment picture because everyone's concerned about enrollment. So how do you communicate this to prospective students, and how do you differentiate that from the hundreds of other colleges that are out there? So Francy, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Luoluo and then back to Rob.
I could not unmute myself. That's always fun. So, for me, a lot of this has to do with the educational pieces that are showing up for folks. We've got to make sure that we are doing a good job at helping people to understand what it is that we're trying to do, what are our goals, what are the real pieces that we are looking for from our outcomes. A lot of times we just assume that people know what we're looking for. We assume that everybody understands what is happening, and we assume that everybody needs the same thing. And that's not necessarily the case. I also think it's important to understand as an institution what we actually can do, because some institutions are trying to do more than they can. And you have to be honest with yourself about, as an institution, here is what we can provide. And if you cannot provide what is needed, what are the other places that you can go? And how are you having honest conversations with your student body, with your faculty, with your staff about what you can do and how you can assist in those spaces? I think that's a really critical kind of first start to engaging in some of this work and thinking about how you are communicating that out to a number of your different stakeholders. diverse.
Yeah. Luoluo, how about you at Georgia Tech? Like I think that's a really good point by Francy. Like, let's be honest, right? We can't do, every institution can't do everything. So how does that play out in the admissions process?
I agree with Francie very much. One of the things that is so important as I make decisions about resources and personnel and time and energy is to remind ourselves we're first and foremost an educational institution, not a social welfare one. Now, what do we need to do to deliver that educational mission means it's changed over time because our students have. Now, I'm going to say something that will probably bring on some haters. On this Zoom. I'm at an institution where enrollment growth is our challenge. It's a little bit different, but I do want to stress an aspect of our enrollment management approach that is different, that is requiring us to pivot, is that we're trying to ensure that we are enrolling and graduating a student body that better reflects the community within which we sit, right? We're in major metropolitan area, Atlanta, tremendous diversity defined across many different identities. And so we're making a purposeful effort to increase the number of students we admit from low and limited income families, students who come from Black and Brown families, students who are transfer. So those are things that I think are important to us. And so as we do that, we have to think about how we're communicating about the Georgia Tech experience. We can't just use the same story. I'm going to put on I'm a former senior enrollment management officer. And one of the things that as technology has risen is I think universities, as Rob said, we're a little bit slow to pivot, right? Is we haven't fully understand how the narratives that are out there about us are faster and more powerful than the narratives we create ourselves on our own behalf. And so I fully believe that we have to create a college experience for the students with us now that they then go back and tell their families, their brothers and sisters when they go back to see their friends from high school. That story is just as important. It's sort of like minding the story, not just when we're being listened to, but when we're not, when we think we aren't being observed. That actually is where we have to be very mindful and create authentically an experience that is embracing, that is supportive, that is inclusive, and that really follows through what we say to students that we're going to offer, that we then actually deliver that in their actual experience. And that, I think, is an important story that can help recruit and retain our students.
Yeah, so Rob, I'm curious for your take on this, especially what questions do you think that institutions need to be ready for? Like, what questions should prospective parents and students and guardians and counselors, high school counselors be asking? And what do you think, and what have you been arming your admissions and enrollment teams with? Like, you need to be ready for these questions.
Sure. So, I think there are sort of three things to look at. So one, I think that each college or university needs to talk about, their approach to wellness and prevention. It needs to be able to talk about what's unique about it. So for us, we were sort of at the head of things in creating an integrated approach. So for us, we talk a lot about what that looks like and how that might be different from other campuses. I think that also the accessibility of programs and services, certainly I think our model is one that's very broad reaching. There are multiple entry points and ways that you can engage with it. And then I think finally, the effectiveness of what folks provide. So, we've been doing prevention programming for a number of years, like every other campus, but we're seeing actual results in terms of changing student behaviors. We're seeing reductions in high-risk behaviors, reductions in sexual and relationship violence. So I think it's those kinds of things that students and families really want to know about.
So I want to talk a little bit about faculty and staff involvement, because we were talking earlier about this is a campus effort. And Francy, let me start with you on this, because question I get all the time is, we're working really hard on this, but it's like a portion of campus, not everybody, right? So how can you get everyone on campus kind of rowing in the same direction on well-being and safety, especially faculty? And no disrespect to faculty, but sometimes they don't think it's their job, right? They think it's a job of student affairs, right? Or somebody else, right? So how do we we talk a lot about culture change earlier. How do we get that culture to extend throughout campus?
Absolutely. So I would say as a senior administrator, one of the most important things that has to happen is that there has to be a relationship between student affairs and academic affairs. My closest relationship on the cabinet is with our provost, because we have to be in sync in the work that we're doing. I also think you cannot just kind of send out blast messages to faculty and expect them to feel seen. Faculty like to feel seen, and they are researchers and inquisitive by nature. So they are going to ask the question, why? So on our campus, we've had strategic conversations with the deans of the different colleges to help them to understand, what does this look like in your specific college? How might this show up for your particular major? We've worked with faculty to help them understand the benefit to them, right? So partnering with us in this work, let us show you how this helps you. Right. So when we hear from them about the different situations that are going on in their classrooms, the concerns that they have for students, the concerns that they have for themselves, we are seeking to meet that need, which allows them to think differently about their interactions with us and really allows them to say, oh, I want to be involved in a different kind of way. We recently have started doing a couple of different webinars and opening them up to our entire faculty population. And then after the webinar, we kind of create these cheat sheets, if you will, for faculty that say, hey, we just had this webinar. Here are the things and the ways that this may show up on our campus. Here are the resources that you can directly tie into. If you want to have private conversations, if you'd like some scripted language, we can give that to you as well. So I do think it has to take a little initiative in understanding who the faculty are and how to make sure that you're speaking their language in a way that makes sense, but you have to have that institutional buy-in, and you have to make sure that you are giving them the information that they need in a way that they can digest it in real time so that it comes back out. Again, we're all trained very differently, but at the center of what we do, it is about serving students for all of us.
Yeah. So Rob, how do you make this a kind of strategic initiative that rises to the level of everybody in senior leadership and even to the board?
Yeah, so, I think certainly, our campus leadership and board, are very aware of the national landscape regarding mental health. And we've shared data with them specifically from our own student population, that speaks to the needs of our students, and different strategies that we need to employ moving forward. Similar to Francy, we've also shared data with our academic deans about the specific needs of students in their schools and colleges, and then also are making recommendations to them to address, those particular needs. And then again, I think we're being very intentional in tying our data to specific strategies that address areas of concern. And all of the work is in the context of student success and retention, understanding that healthy, well-adjusted students are most likely to persist and graduate from the university.
Yeah. So we're having some Zoom issues with this video, so we're actually not going to show it live, but we are going to send it out as a separate file. It was a great interview with Jen Jacobson at Macalester, a great case study of what she's doing there. We'll send that out as a separate file, as folks who have been veterans of the Next Office Hour knows. We regularly do these videos, and for some reason today we're having technical difficulties with that, so we'll send it out as a separate file. So we'll continue on. If you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A. Let's keep talking in the chat. And Luoluo, something came up in the chat that I kind of find interesting. Here, it's somewhat of a question, I guess. Sally Sue Brown said, just completed 6 admitted student days at colleges ranging from 1,800 to 18,000. Struck by how many of these schools offered what we termed academic resort features, such as wellness, massage chairs, meditation rooms, comfort dogs, aromatherapy sprays, salt therapy rooms, right? Like, are these things that maybe colleges are kind of showing off as bells and whistles, but not really as part of making a real difference? Can you talk a little bit about that at all, Luoluo, about, what, again, going back to this idea of what should we be looking for when we go to admitted student days to know that this is making a difference?
So I'm going to say that right now what we have is difficulty distinguishing, right? Is because so many universities, because this is a national topic of conversation, are talking about how they're contributing. So I think it is becoming difficult for families to be able to discern what's real, what's not, and in particular for our first generation. families, right, who are also worried about the well-being for their students, but don't necessarily always know where to go for that information. So I think what is good, I say this about the pandemic, right? Find the lemonade from the lemons, is
Right.
that the pandemic did something that many of us who are public health professionals celebrated, is it made public health a family household word, right? It became, all of a sudden, everyone on campus was talking public health. So that's a real good thing. But we're also seeing some indication that we're retrenching from some of the good practices and attitudinal changes that happened, right? I'm hearing students talking about, now that the quote unquote pandemic is quote unquote over, that they're, and employees too, feeling a sense that they're sick shaming. Like, hey, the pandemic's over. Like, what are you doing? You have to be sick and you can't come in. And you know, these are parts of the culture. So I think what is important is to ask the students who are there, right? And say, what has been your experience like? Because those tools, if you will, are important. And this is what our students told us. We hear you loud and clear, Georgia Tech, that you care about our well-being. But then we go into class and all those academic stressors come into play, because the messages we're getting there are different. And that's where my anxiety gets triggered, my stress gets triggered, I feel alone, I feel isolated, I feel like, you know, I don't know where I can turn. And so all of those things are sort of contradicted, if you will. And so I think, you know, going back to that earlier question of how do we engage the whole, a couple thoughts that I'd share is, one, remember that culture change takes many years. Right? We're used to an academic year. Culture change doesn't happen in 9 months. And if that's what you're expecting and using that as a benchmark to measure, you'll be disappointed, because that isn't how culture changes. I'm always reminded by Larry Abely at Florida State. He changed the enrollment trajectory there and improved retention and graduation. And he said he needed to commit to many, many years at that institution to make that happen, right? So 5 to 7 years to change the culture. So that's one. Two, water the grass, not the rocks. I think what happens in higher ed is we always us and they them, and we all do it, right? So I'm going to guess that a lot of us on here are in student affairs, and maybe not necessarily as many in academic affairs, but we all engage in using and theming behavior. And the reality is that we have to, how do we hold up where each of us can act in our strength? And so here at Georgia Tech, we're an R1. And when I say R1, we're like R1 on steroids, right? And so to get faculty to think that they're going to do the things that we do in student affairs is not realistic, A, nor appropriate, B. Instead, how do we help our faculty be the best versions of themselves doing what they do? So how do we improve teaching and learning, right? Not necessarily, for example, get them in front of mental health first aid training. I think that's a good initiative, but I think that probably isn't the first thing that I would say is, how do you craft the syllabus? How do you introduce the class on the first day, particularly if you teach a substantial number of first-year students, where you're setting the tone for what colleges is like, and two, what your relationship with the faculty is like, right? And so helping our faculty craft a syllabus that is inviting, engaging, is accessible, helps students who are first-generation college students, for example, understand the culture of higher ed, define what an office hour is, right? So that they know, oh, that's when I come to you for help. So I think, how do we help each of us hold up our unique strengths from our respective professional areas is how we bring everyone in. And so, but that watering the grass, not the rocks, I think is important to sustaining hope and just sustaining the effort, if you will.
But at some point it may not be sustainable. And I want to talk about that. I want to get to some of the questions. We're getting some really good questions. We have a little bit more than 10 minutes left. So let me get to some of the questions we're getting from the audience, and then I'll go back to some of the questions that I had. And Francy, let me start with you on one. We have a question from a career coach who's at a very large institution. And as she said, he said, or they said, my sessions often cross the thin line of mental health, stress, and emotional regulation, especially due to external factors out of our control. Is there a better way to serve students? What have institutions implemented to ensure they're reaching students, especially if they have thousands of students who feel as though they're not being helped? At what point, I think this is the real question here, at what point do we say we're doing our best? This is what we can do, right? Like, as we've said earlier on, we can't hire ourselves out of this. At some point, like, where does that point come, Fran'Cee, especially for, I think, a majority of institutions on the office hour today who are not extremely well resourced, right? And they can't do it all.
So I think this is a great question, and it's absolutely where my institution is, because I think, you know, part of this is the number of institutions institutions are quote unquote punching above their weight,
Yeah.
right? Like we literally are doing far more than we can and should be doing, but we're doing it. And so I really do think it is about each institution and having some very honest conversations. So as a career coach, when you're continuing to see this, when this happens, right? How are we documenting this? Again, we talked a little bit earlier about assessment. How often is this occurring? Because at times, if we're not really good at thinking about how we're capturing information and how we're presenting that information, it can feel to some people as if it's just a one-off, or that's just happening over here, or people are just comfortable with this particular person and not understanding that no, actually we have a systemic problem. And so I do think the first piece is how are we capturing the information and making sure that we're having this discussion and presenting it effectively. Two, I think there was something that was said earlier in terms of the orientation components, right? So how, again, are we being strategic in thinking about what is the arc of the experience of a student and what are the places where we can plug in to make sure that we are reaching students in different ways to help them to understand what the institution can and cannot do. I'll go back to what I said. We have to start having some really honest dialogues and conversations with ourselves as institutions about what we are able to do. And I think it was, said earlier, and this is a conversation that happens all the time. We are not social service agencies. And that is tough for people to say because we want to be there for students and we want to support students. And in some of our spaces, we have to develop better relationships and MOUs with external partners who can start to come in and assist and support students in ways that we might not be able to. And we need to talk about that from the beginning. We should not be saying to students, oh, you're going to have access to this resource as much as you want when we know that we have a 3-session limit. We need to go ahead and say that to students from the beginning. Or we know that you need more care than we can provide. So let's go ahead and put those resources in front of you from the very beginning. And that's tough because we want to make sure that we can check those boxes and we want to make sure that we can do all things for students. But sometimes we have to be astute enough to say what we can't do, right? And that actually empowers us a little bit more and frees up more space for people. We also have to be very clear in understanding that students are coming to us with way more situations in life than they have before. And we are not going to be able to fix all of these situations, but we can start them on that path and on the journey of helping them to get through and to giving them the tools that they need. But sometimes we are not going to be able to fix something that has been going on for a very long time that the student is just now realizing or ready to engage with. And so again, honest conversations, what can we do? How are we utilizing our area resources and putting in place MOUs with some of those support systems?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the honesty thing we talked about earlier, because as somebody just put in the chat, I think parents conclude a different idea of what the school will provide. I think that's true, right? Not setting those expectations up earlier. Also, some of the expectations, Rob, are a little bit around, and I talked to, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but we got another question on it about assessment metrics. Like, how do you determine the effectiveness of your approaches? And particularly this person's asking, what assessment tools and metrics do you use to figure out what's working, what's not?
Yeah, so I think that we often will look at, crafting our own tools or looking at national tools that'll help us create benchmarks and make comparisons with other like institutions. And I think, assessments take many forms. They're not just surveys, they are also, focus groups. They are, making sure that we give voice to the data as well. We have a very regular set of ways that we connect with the student body, a very regular schedule of ways that we connect. So we assess our health and wellness every 2 years. We have something called the Orange Survey that looks broadly at the student experience, both in terms of, again, some of those transactional areas, as well as ways that they're connecting with faculty and staff on campus, where they're finding belonging. We have a campus climate survey that we do regularly as well. And part of this is really meant to help us figure out, are the things that we're doing actually making a difference? And if they're not, then we're changing our strategy, changing our approach to make sure that we're investing our resources where they really can make a difference. give you a real quick example. In our health and wellness survey, we found that students were really struggling with issues around, adversity. So whether it's an issue of a relationship conflict or academic performance, social difficulties, whatever that might be, we developed a resilience program to help students build skills that will help them feel a greater sense of belonging, self-efficacy, self-compassion. And what we've seen is tremendous success in students' social and emotional well-being, including a significant reduction in anxiety and depression, for some of the populations completing the program. So, I think that regular assessment cycle is really important to make sure that you're really understanding the needs of your student population.
So one other question from the audience, and then we're going to do a wrap-up question for everybody. And Lola, let me ask you this one. Somebody asked about prevention changes your institutions have implemented to set up students for success in their own health behaviors. For example, better food choices on campus, physical activity requirement, changes in class schedule to promote sleep. Anything you can speak to on that front?
Yes. A couple things I think is important is to, first of all, have a campus-wide discussion and agree on the definition of prevention, right? So I went through this as a former professional in the area of sexual violence reduction, is that oftentimes we implement things that we call prevention, but they're actually intervention, right, further down. So that's important so that we're being true to ourselves of what we're implementing. I'll give you one specific example that we're about to launch here at Georgia Tech that really is focused on prevention. And part of it is our students told us, you really focus on if we're in crisis, then go get help. And our students told us over and over my first year here, right? So this was sort of our focus groups and our listening sessions. They said, but we don't hear a lot from Georgia Tech about how to prevent getting into that crisis situation in the first place. So at Georgia Tech, we give priority housing assignment to our first year students. There is no requirement to live on. So it's just priority assignment. If you wish and you apply, then you get the priority assignment. By happenstance, 97% of our entering first year students end up living on campus. We did not leverage that, right? When I got here, I'm like, we have 97% of our first year students living on campus. What are we doing with that? So this fall, our student engagement wellbeing team is going to launch a first year wellbeing initiative. We're going to focus on each of the 8 dimensions, one each month, and that's how we'll organize our educational, social, communication activities around. And the idea is that we do basic things like, how do you recognize when you're feeling stressed, right? I taught APPH 1040, and in that course I had, you should take it earlier, but I had seniors in the course that said, I wish I took this course earlier because I learned how to recognize when I'm in stress so I can reach out and do something. And I wish I'd known that my first year. So that is an example really concrete of how we're really trying to pivot and get information and viable tools and information to our students earlier in their time at Georgia Tech so they can actually use them to good effect.
This is great. And as usual, we should have office hours because this hour goes by way too fast. So let me just do a quick lightning round to each of you, 30 seconds, 45 seconds for each. What are the emerging trends, future directions in student well-being programs? What innovations or changes do you foresee coming in the next couple of years that we should be paying attention to now? Rob, let me start with you, then go to you, Francy, and then we'll go to you, Lola.
Yeah, so I think, we're going to see more campuses looking holistically at student health and wellness, particularly in the classroom, and integrating efforts across the campus to create a true wellness culture. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to see. The other thing is, I think we're going to see much greater understanding of the connection between belonging and wellness, and campuses will start developing strategies to increase student belonging on campus. So those are 2 things in particular I think that we're going to see.
Yeah, Francy, where is this going next? What are we going to be talking about a couple of years from now?
Yeah, mine is going to kind of be a slightly negative one. I think that we're going to see increased tension between the academic side of the house and student affairs and student well-being work, because as we continue to push and students continue to push for their well-being and sense of belonging, at times that is going to come into conflict with the way in which people think about the academic pursuit and the way in which we engage in that process. And so I do think there's going to have to be a lot of information and collaboration and partnership to find the synergy between the two, to make sure that people are working together to support students and also make sure that we are completing the mission of our institutions.
That's important. So bringing those two sides together right now, more critical than ever.
Yes.
Lola, how about you? What are you foreseeing on the?
I will second Rob and Francy, but add that I think where we are in the future is that the health equity gap will open. Because as we start to have some of the tools that we've had, for example, EdTrust has some great research that says that tools that focus on financial differences, financial inequity, while important, cannot replace policies that, for example, are race-based to address issues of racial inequity. So I think as we face this challenge together as a country, that this will emerge in the health and well-being of our students, opening up those gaps.
Lolo, Robert, Francy, thank you so much for your time, giving of your time and expertise today on the next office hour. As we said, in addition to this recording, we will send out this separate recording that we weren't able to show today, which on Jacobson and Macalester College. Thank you again to Vector Solutions for their support of today's next office hour. We'll be coming up again on May 2nd with our next office hour on enrollment. So please join us then for that, and we'll be sending out information along with the recording later this week. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a good day and stay safe.